All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. In this recording, we're going to begin looking at Matthew chapter 24. And the reality is, this is a little bit of a difficult chapter because sometimes we read it from our own perspective and through our own lens. And as a result, we fail to hear it as Jesus intended it to his original audience. And that's always the goal when studying the Bible, is to make sure we're understanding the original meaning before we seek to apply that meaning to our life. And we need to really work hard to maybe even unlearn some things to hear Matthew 24 well. Matthew 24 is part of that climactic teaching block in the Gospel of Matthew that I think really should just be seen as beginning in chapter 23, and it goes through chapter 24 and into chapter 25. And this section here in Matthew 24 is frequently, it seems to me, misrepresented and misapplied. Now, to help us hear it well, we need to recognize that Matthew 24 is paralleled by Mark chapter 13 and Luke 21. And so we can read Luke 21, Mark 13, and Matthew 24 all together. And here's the thing to make sure we pay attention to. Whereas Matthew was originally written to a Jewish audience and thus using language and styles of communication and maybe even Old Testament allusions or references in a way that would have immediately made sense to a Jewish audience, Luke 21, the parallel there in Luke, well, it was written to a Gentile audience. And the reason that's so important to notice is because Luke then frees up some of Jesus' teaching to make it more clear and understandable to non-Jews. And so in some ways, Luke 21 provides a little bit of a key to unlock our understanding of Matthew 24 and even of Mark 13. And the first thing that becomes clear really in Matthew 24, but even more so in Luke 21, is that Jesus' teaching here this is really important, is first and foremost about the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in the year 70 AD. It's not first and foremost about the second coming, as so often is assumed when we open up our Bible to Matthew 24 and just start reading. Sometimes we assume that it's all about the second coming, and it's just not. It's first and foremost about the Roman destruction of Jerusalem that happened in 70 AD. The reason we come to the assumption that this is about the second coming is we are failing really to read Matthew 24 and Mark 13 as a first century Jewish Christian would have. And again, that's why the parallel with Luke 21 is so helpful and so important, because Luke's version makes it obvious that it's about the Roman siege of Jerusalem and the implications of that siege for Jesus' followers in the city and what they're supposed to do. But not only does Luke 21 make that obvious, really, the questions that are asked at the outset of chapter 24, as well as the contextual context at the end of chapter 23, actually those things make the topic very clear as well. Jesus and his disciples have left the temple in Jerusalem. They're actually sitting on the Mount of Olives looking at the Jerusalem temple. So they're looking at the city of Jerusalem and the skyline, and what dominates their field of view from the Mount of Olives is the massive Jerusalem temple. And Jesus says to them, look how that beautiful building is. It's going to be torn down and destroyed. And the disciples ask, Lord, when will this happen? And what will the sign of your coming be? And at the end of chapter 23, right before those questions get asked and right before that scene, Jesus had said to Jerusalem that her house is going to be left to her desolate. Her house refers to her temple. Because of their faithlessness, the rejection of him as king, Jesus says, your house, that is your temple, is going to be left desolate. Keep reading across the chapter break, and what you'll see is this picture of the disciples and Jesus sitting on the Mount of Olives saying, it's going to be destroyed. It's going to be torn down. And so that's what's going on here in Matthew chapter 24. That's the topic at hand. Here's the way one New Testament scholar, Robert Stein, puts it. He says, the failure of Israel, especially of its leadership, to fulfill its mission, Israel's lack of fruit, and Israel's hostility towards Jesus, God's anointed, all lead to the inevitable judgment resulting in the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. And that destruction happened in the year 70 AD. Now, that event did not happen in a vacuum. It was actually part of or culmination of a long history of foreign occupation and oppression and Jewish revolt. During the decades of the New Testament period, the time period of Jesus' life and of the apostles and their letters and all that, during the decades of the New Testament period, there were numerous revolutionaries that showed up in Israel. There were sporadic revolts that were put down with great brutality by their Roman overlords, and all of that revolt and revolution came to nothing. And this mood of rebellion continued all throughout the first century, and it was fanned into flame by a growing nationalism that longed to throw off of Roman control. And in the midst of all that comes Jesus. And he wasn't like the other messianic revolutionaries. He didn't come trying to gather a small army or fanning and fomenting the flames of revolt. Instead, he himself came preaching a different message, and he himself was put down by the Romans. He was crucified like so many other revolutionaries were, but his message was different. And granted, we who are followers of Jesus know that not only was he crucified, he was raised from the dead, but those who reject him tried to ignore that message. And in the wake of Jesus' life and death and resurrection, there were more rebels, there were more claims to be messiahs, there were more executions, there were more threats, there were new Roman governors, and so on for the decades following Jesus. And all of that erupted into a full-scale revolt by the mid-60s of the first century. That is 30 years after the life of Jesus, you get a full-scale revolt in Jerusalem against Rome. And the Romans came in force to put down this revolt. They surrounded the city of Jerusalem. They laid siege to it for 3.5 years. And then in the year AD 70, they leveled the city and they burnt down the temple and they destroyed it all. And Jesus, with prophetic insight, can see this coming. And that's why he says, your house is going to be left to you desolate. And Matthew 24 that we're beginning to look at here in this recording, well, it's a prophetic styled warning focused on really preparing his disciples, strengthening his disciples for what's going to come in the decades ahead. So that's the main topic here, the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to come in about 40 years from when Jesus offers this teaching on the side of the Mount of Olives. Some of what Jesus says, however, sounds like it points beyond that event and maybe points to a greater sort of judgment that's going to come in the future, maybe even towards his return. And so scholars wrestle with how to sort out what's said in Matthew 24. Is there some things that is not just about the destruction of Jerusalem, but maybe goes beyond it to Jesus' second coming? So how do we sort that out? Or should we even sort that out? And that's the challenge. There's things about immediately after the tribulation of those days, they'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds and things like that. It's like, are we talking still about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, or are we pointing ahead to something beyond that? So here's how I think Matthew chapter 24 works. The disciples ask Jesus 2 questions. Maybe the disciples kind of assume they go together, maybe not sure. But Jesus treats them as 2 separate questions. One question is about, when is this temple going to be destroyed, Jesus? And Jesus answers that question in the first part of the chapter. And the second question is about, well, what about the sign of the end of the age in your coming? And Jesus seems to answer that question in the last little bit of the chapter and on into chapter 25. That seems to be what's going on. And so Matthew 24, verses 4 through 35, here's the breakdown. Matthew 24, 4 through 35 focuses on the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew 24, verses 36 to 51, and then on into chapter 25, well, that focuses on the Parousia, the appearing or the arrival, the coming of Jesus and the end of the age. That seems to be what's going on here. Now, nevertheless, the main focus of the majority of the chapter is on the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple as a judgment from God, even if some of the language might be a little bit hard for us to grasp. So, with that by way of introduction and overview, let's jump into the first little bit of Matthew chapter 24, picking up in verse 1, and in this recording we'll go down to verse 14. It begins this way by setting up the situation. Jesus left the temple area and was going on his way when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. Now, keep in mind where we're at in the life of Jesus. It's Passover week for Jesus and his Jewish followers. It's Passover week, and they're in Jerusalem. Jesus has been staying with friends in a little outlying town called Bethany, and he's been traveling to Jerusalem during the day and then back to Bethany at night. And he's been spending his time during the day in the temple, debating with the Jewish leaders and teaching the people in Jerusalem. Well, now we've come towards the end of this day, and it's really the last time Jesus is going to be in the temple. He has taught all day, and he's done. He's leaving the temple. He's not going to be in the temple again. And so he and his disciples are leaving Jerusalem. They're leaving the temple. They're heading out up the Mount of Olives and over to Bethany. And these disciples come to him, and as they're looking back over their shoulder, Jesus just said that this house is going to be left desolate. And they're saying, look at how beautiful these buildings are. In fact, in Mark's gospel, it includes more descriptive language of what they actually say. They say, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. And they're not joking. The entire temple complex was massive. And its construction had actually been begun decades earlier by Herod the Great. And it was so massive and such a huge building project that it's still being completed in Jesus' day, 3 decades after the death of Herod the Great. In essence, what Herod did was he built huge retaining walls and filled them in so he could flatten out the top of the mountain on which the temple sat and thus create a huge platform for the temple to sit on. It actually was the largest temple complex in the entire Greco-Roman world at the time. If it hadn't been a Jewish temple, it would have been one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It covered about 36 acres, right? You could fit like 25 football fields in this complex. The western wall alone, which is partly visible still to this day, it's the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem today. The western wall alone was 1,574 feet long. Massive. The height of these walls varied because, you're on topography that's a little bit hilly and uneven. But the highest point of the temple, the wall reached 160 feet high. And the stones that were used to build these retaining walls of the temple were 15 feet thick. It was a massive structure that included not only this platform, but courtyards and porches and buildings all around the perimeter. There was even some meeting chambers underneath. And then in the middle of all of that was the temple proper that was made of white limestone gilded with gold. That temple proper rose above the platform to the height of an 18-story building. Josephus said that from a distance it looked like a snow-capped mountain. And so it's no wonder that the disciples come to Jesus. Look at these beautiful buildings. Look at these wonderful stones. How did Jesus respond? Well, look at verse 2. Jesus responded and said to them, do you see all these things? Do you see all these stones, all these buildings? Do you see how beautiful that thing is? Do you see all that? Truly, I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. You see, from even here, just with Jesus' initial words, that it makes it clear what we're talking about. The topic is the temple stones being pulled down and torn down. And when you add to that the end of chapter 23, right, your house, your temple is going to be left to you desolate. That's what we're talking about. This is all going to be torn down and destroyed. And it was in the year 70 AD. Verse 3 continues and says, "As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately and said, 'Tell us when these things will happen, and what will the sign of your coming and the end of the age be?'" That's where we get these two questions that the large speech in chapter 24 is going to answer. And as I said, it may be possible that they think of them as like sort of one complex of events, but Jesus answers them as if they're two questions. When will the temple be destroyed? And when will your coming be? That's the two questions it seems to me that he sets out to answer in chapter 24 and on into chapter 25. And you see that in the little pivot point between verses 35 and 36. You get, of that day, there's going to be signs in the little parable that leads up and culminates in chapter 25. There's going to be some signs, and he's going to tell them what the signs of the destruction of the temple are. But then when you point towards his coming in verse 36, you say, but of that day, no one knows. And so we have two questions that are answered in various parts of the chapter. Beginning in verse 4 down through verse 35, Jesus answers their question about the destruction of the temple. And then, beginning in verse 36, with the contrast of, but of that day there are no signs, Jesus is talking about his coming. What are the signs of your coming? There are none, Jesus seems to say in verses 36 and following. And so here, in this recording, we're going to work our way down through the first part of the first section. Jesus' answer to that first question. We're going to look down through verse 14, where Jesus is explaining about the destruction of the temple. So Jesus begins to answer the question about that in verse 4 and says, Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name saying, 'I'm the Christ,' and they will lead many." And so he's warning. Remember, he's going to answer these questions in a way that prepares them for what lies ahead. And one of the things he wants them to know is, you're going to hear all sorts of rumors about messiahs showing up. Beware of that. Be on watch for that. They're going to mislead many people. So people coming and saying, "I'm the Christ," means I'm the Messiah. And there were plenty of messianic pretenders among the Jews in the decades leading up to Jesus and the decades coming after Jesus before the temple was destroyed. People claiming that they were going to lead the revolution and they were going to bring the freedom and they were going to be the Messiah. And it didn't pan out. They led people astray, and it all culminates in the destruction of the temple. Jesus says, be on guard for that. He continues in verse 6 and says, "And you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars, and see that you're not alarmed. Those things must take place, but that's not yet the end." Now remember, what question is Jesus answering? The question he's answering is, when will the temple be destroyed? That's the question he's answering. So you have to hear the word "the end" in that context. We're talking about the end of the temple, which also meant for the Jews the end of the present order of things. It would be cataclysmic for the Romans to come in and destroy Jerusalem and tear down their temple, end their sacrificial system, end worship as they knew it. It would be the end of an era. It would be like a foreign country coming into my country, the United States of America, and leveling the White House and the Capitol building and setting up their own government. It's the end. It's the end. Well, that's what we're talking about here. You're going to hear about wars, rumors of wars. Don't be alarmed. Remember, he's trying to strengthen and prepare his followers, his disciples. Don't be alarmed. Those things must take place, but it's not the end of the present order. It's not the end of the temple. In fact, Matthew actually uses two different words for end in chapter 24 to distinguish what end he's referring to. When Jesus is talking about the end of the temple, as he is here, he uses the simple word telos. It's just the basic word for the culmination of things or the end of something. But when he's referring to the end of the age, to distinguish it from just that end, Jesus uses soon telos, soon telia, which is the ultimate end, like the great end. He adds a prefix to it to emphasize we're talking there about the big end. And that distinction is really important. And so this wars and rumors of wars is about the end of the temple and about the first century. We have to make sure we hear that. During the first century, Israel, as I already noted, existed in a mood of revolt and rebellion. And this mood of rebellion continued to be fanned into flame by that growing Jewish nationalism that longed to throw off Roman control. And during the decades of the New Testament period, there were all sorts of revolutionaries and revolts and wars, not only in Israel and around Israel, but all throughout the Roman Empire. And that all culminated with the siege of Jerusalem that led to it being leveled and destroyed in the year 70 AD. Jesus goes on here to give more details of what he has in mind. Look at verse 7. He says, "For nation will rise up against nation, kingdom up against kingdom. There will be famines, earthquakes in various places. All these things are merely like the beginning of birth pains." So remember, it's not the end. When you start seeing, when you hear about messianic pretenders, when you hear about wars and rumors of wars, when you hear about famines and earthquakes, he's telling his disciples, that's just like the beginning. Know that things are starting to happen, but we haven't gotten to the end of the temple yet. That's what he's talking about. And this period, in the decades around Jesus' life, after Jesus' life, leading up to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, this period was a time period that was full of chaos for the Roman Empire. In fact, the Roman historian Tacitus, writing shortly after the first century, pulling together a history of Rome and the Roman people, describes the chaotic times of the decade that led up to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. He says this, he says, that period was one rich in disasters, terrible with battles, torn by civil struggles, horrible even in peace. 4 emperors fell by the sword, one after another. There were civil wars, more foreign wars, often both at the same time. Italy was distressed by disasters unknown before or coming again after the lapse of the ages. Besides the manifold misfortunes that befell mankind, there were prodigies in the sky, there were signs on the earth, warnings given by thunderbolts, and prophecies about the future. That's a Roman historian describing what's going on in the Roman Empire leading up to it. And it sounds very similar to what Jesus just has said. Wars and rumors of wars and famines and nation rising against nation. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the chaos that's going to lead and ultimately culminate in the destruction of the temple. In fact, the Jewish historian Josephus, again, writing in the first century, right around the time period of the Jewish revolt that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem, he uses similar language to Jesus to describe the demise of Jerusalem. He is a Jewish historian who saved his own skin by writing the account of what's happening for the sake of the Romans, and he uses words like, or phrases like, don't be led astray. He talks about wars during this time period. 61 times he uses the word wars. Insurrections, which Jesus uses here 24 times. Earthquakes, famines, pestilences, terrors, even great signs in the heaven. That's what the Jewish historian Josephus, how he describes it, the words he used to describe it. And so that's what Jesus is talking about. So they ask Jesus when the temple in Jerusalem will be destroyed, and Jesus says in a nutshell, things are going to get really bad around here first and really bad in the surrounding world. And that's going to go on for a while, like the beginning of birth pains, just starting to get things going, and it's going to get really awful. There are going to be people who are going to claim to be leading the messianic charge to get rid of the Romans. Don't listen to them. All of this is to prepare them for what's about to lie ahead and what they're going to have to deal with over the next few decades. Jesus continues in verse 9 and says, "Then they will hand you over to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name." Mark's parallel to this actually adds a little more details. He says, "But be on your guard, for they'll hand you over to the courts. You'll be flogged, that's whipped in the synagogues. You'll stand before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them." And when you hear what Matthew, how he records it, and what Mark says as he puts it, and then you read the book of Acts, and that's exactly what you see happening to the 12 who Jesus is talking to at this moment. This is the stuff they are dealing with, that they're going to experience this, and it happens that way in the book of Acts. And the Apostle Paul, he mentions plenty of this same sort of stuff in his letters, just like it's mentioned in Acts. That's what happened to them, in the decades following these words by Jesus. Now, Jesus then goes on to talk about the effect of all of this chaos and all of this difficulty in the first century on those who are followers of him. Look at verse 10. And at that time, says Jesus, many will fall away. When this happens, during the first century, right, when things are out of control, as Tacitus and Josephus said, and when life was crazy and things were getting awful in Israel, at that time, many will fall away. And they will betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will rise up and mislead many people. And because lawlessness is increased, many people's love will become cold. That's what's going to happen to even some of those who say they follow Jesus, say that they want to know him, is the chaos is actually going to lead them to actually grow cold in their faith and faithfulness to him. But, Jesus says in verse 13, it's the one who endures to the end who will be saved. The one who endures to the end of their life. The one who endures all the way through all this chaos. In fact, when it says to endure unto the end, that idiom in Greek often means fully or completely and finally. That's the idea. It's the one who endures fully and finally who will be saved. That you have to make it to the finish line in order to be saved from both the events of that day, but saved ultimately with God as well. And then Jesus says, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Then the end of Jerusalem will come. Then the end of the temple will come and all that. Now, a couple things to note out of verse 14 is that when it says that the gospel will be preached to all the nations, well, the word nations is the same idea for Gentiles, that this gospel is going to go beyond Israel, beyond those disciples that have been listening to Jesus for the last 3 years. It's going to go to the nations. It's going to go to the Gentiles. And the good news, therefore, that God has installed his king, Messiah Jesus, and is now calling all people everywhere, even the nations, the Gentiles themselves, to repent. Well, that's going to go beyond Israel, and that's got to happen first, just as the prophets said it would way back in Isaiah and Amos and other ones of the Old Testament prophets who said in the days of the Messiah, God's kingdom is going to extend all the way to the Gentiles, all the way to the nations. And so Jesus is simply saying, yeah, that's what's going to happen before all this stuff comes to be. And notice he says that the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world. Well, we could easily, I think, overread that. The word for whole world here in Greek is oikumene, and it referred to the known or the inhabited world. In other words, from the Roman perspective, it was the Roman world. And that's exactly how Paul understood his ministry, for example. So Romans 15:23, the Apostle Paul says that he has accomplished the task in the east. There's nowhere else him to preach in these regions, so it's time for him to move west to Spain. In fact, in Colossians, Paul says this, writing in the early 60s, Colossians, Paul says this, listen to what he says, the gospel which has come to you just as in all the world is also bearing fruit and increasing. Did you hear that? Paul thinks that he has preached the gospel to the whole world. And that's the idea, is that the gospel is going to go out of Israel and out to the whole world before the end of the temple and the end of Jerusalem is going to come. So, to summarize, some of Jesus' disciples were talking about how beautiful the temple was. And Jesus then said, but it's all going to be torn down and destroyed. And they asked him, well, when's that going to happen? What's the sign of that? And Jesus has said that first, there are some like preliminary signs, early indication, early warning signs, but they're not quite the final culmination of it all. Things are going to get really bad on the national level, the international level, even the personal level, but that's not the end. That's going to go on for a while. It's like the early birth pains coming up on women in labor. So that's the beginning of indicators to tell you, oh, things are starting to happen. It's going to get ready. But what's the real sign, the ultimate sign that we're right at the end? We're right at the end when the temple is going to be destroyed. Well, that's where Jesus goes next in verse 15 and following, and we'll save that for our next recording. All right, thanks for tuning into this session on the listener's commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a crowd-funded, listener-supported Bible teaching ministry that is only possible because of the generosity of folks just like you. So thanks a ton to each and every one of you who give to support this ministry, whether you give a little bit each month, whether you give a lot each month, whether you have given a one-time gift. All of that is used to help this ministry continue to grow and increase and make an impact around the world. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you have been encouraged or impacted by this ministry in some regard, could I invite you to prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? The easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a donate page through World Family Mission, my page there on World Family Mission site, where you can put in a dollar amount, click a little box that says make this monthly. You can give a monthly donation that way, or leave that box unclicked and you can give a one-time donation right there as well. So thanks a ton for your support.